In this video, we are going to understand scope and different types of it. Let's take a look at this example where we have three variables, user, username, and odd number. All these three variables are at different locations. We can see the variable user is outside, variable username is inside a block, and variable odd number is inside a function. So how defining a variable inside a block or function can restrict the access? So let's go ahead and log the variable user odd number and username. Refresh the page and here we can see the value area, but second one is throwing an error by saying odd number is not defined. Let's comment this line and refresh again, and we can see username is not defined again. So here we can see that we do not have access to the variable name, username, and odd number. But why is that happening? Why I do not have access to odd number and username? And the answer is because of those variables are in different scope. Now what is scope? So scope is a way in which you can restrict access of any variable in certain area of the code. And there are only two ways you can create scope in JavaScript. The first way is by putting your code inside a block. Now what is block? Block is anything between curly brackets. So whenever you put your code between curly brackets, it creates a block of code. And block will restrict the access to the variable. Similarly, there are another kind of scope called function scope. And function scope can also restrict the access to the variable. In this case, it is odd number. And that is the reason we could not access odd number and username. Now let's check the value of these variables by moving them into their respective scopes. So I'll say console log odd number inside function and console log username inside the block. Refresh the page and we can see in output John 21 and Arya. Because now I'm doing console log in this specific scope, and this scope has access to the variable username, and in this case this scope has access to the variable name odd number. So scope is a way in which you can restrict access of any variable to certain portion of code. And in JavaScript there are only two ways you can create scope. One is block scope and another is function scope. There is also a third type of scope, and that is known as global scope. Any variable that is not inside a block or a function is considered to be a global scope variable. Here in our case, user is a global scope variable. Let's try to look at this example in a diagram form. This is how it will look like. So we have a variable name user, so we'll create a box with the name of user and value of Arya. And you can think of scope to be a private room, something like we create when we are creating our house. So scope creates a private room, and that is what restricts the access to the variable. Inside that block scope, we have a variable name username with a value of John. Similarly, function will create another box, and only inside this box, the variable odd number will be accessed. So we learned about scope and different types of it. Let's move on to understand the rule of scope. There are certain rules that we need to understand when we are thinking of scope. Say for example, I want to access variable username and odd number from different scope. So I'm outside of the scope of block and function and I want to access username and odd number. Can I access them? Let's see. Uncomment this code and here we can say console log username and console log odd number. These are two different scopes and we are trying to access it from outside. Refresh this page and we can see we are getting an error. It means that when you are in different scope and you're trying to access a value in different scope, you cannot do that. It means you cannot cross this boundary. Similarly, in the case of odd number, you cannot do that. And that's why here we can see error. So that is rule number one. The rule number one says if you are in different scope and trying to access a value inside another scope, and to access that you will have to go inside, you cannot do that. So that's why I deleted the arrow. There can also be another scenario. The other scenario is, so you're inside this scope, you have access to variable username. But what if you want to access user? Something like console.log, and we'll say user. We'll just write a message to understand where this console is coming from. So we'll say inside block. Similarly, we'll write the same thing inside function and we'll change the message to inside function. Refresh this, and the error we are seeing is coming from here. So we'll comment out this code and refresh again. And here we can see aria 3 times. The first time says inside block, the second time says inside function, and third time from here. We are able to access that variable. It means that if you're trying to access a variable from a scope and it doesn't exist in that scope, then it bubbles out. It means that it will go to the parent looking for that variable. So the rule says if you're trying to access a variable and you could not find it in your scope, then it will go to the parent by bubbling out, means going out and looking for that variable. So here they will find it, and that's why we see the output aria inside block and aria inside function. It means even if you're trying to access it from this function, you can do that. So there are two rules that we need to understand. The first rule says if you're trying to access value from one scope to another, and to get that value, you have to go inside the scope. You cannot do that. It's not possible. But if you're looking for a variable and you could not find it inside your scope, you can bubble out to your parent and look for that variable. So what it means is that whatever variable is global, anybody can access it. Think about it. Like user is a global variable because it is neither inside block nor inside a function. So user is a global variable. So anybody can access it because if they're looking inside the scope, they will not be able to find it. They will bubble out to the parent and they will be able to find that. So the variable defined in global scope, in our case it is user, will be accessible to each and every line of code that you write. In this way we learned about scope, types of scope, and rules for scope. But what are the benefits of using scope? That is what we are going to see now. So there are two benefits of using scope. The first one is security. Like sometimes you store some sensitive information in a variable and you do not want every line of code in your program to have access to that variable. You store that variable inside some function or a block to restrict the access of other part of the code to your variable. So the first benefit is security. The second benefit is naming collision. What is that? So naming collision is having the same name with different value. What if I go ahead and create another variable called user, but the value will be brand? So here we can see that we have two variables with the same name, but the important thing is they are in two different scope. And when we are accessing it outside here by saying console log user, and we are accessing console log user here. Refresh this and we'll see the first value that was inside block here became brand. So in this way, you can use the same variable name in two different scope with different values. So that is another benefit of using scope. So the first one is security and second is naming collision. So in this way, we learned about scope, different types of scope, rules for scope, and why do we need scope.